I'm going to start this podcast episode plagiarizing some things from our guest's new book. Diabetes is one of the oldest diseases of civilization ever described. Today, it's estimated that up to 400 million people in the world have diabetes. The World Health Organization predicts by the year 2030, diabetes will be the seventh leading cause of death in the world. Based on that estimate, global expenditure on diabetes and its related healthcare will exceed $1 trillion. Well, the book we'll be speaking about today may provide the blueprint to see if we can avoid all this doom and gloom from happening. This is the story of the blood sugar fix with Dr. James DiNicolantonio. Doc, great to see you again, fifth time on.
Thanks for having me back, Casper.
Listen, you nail these books out, and they're always on these kind of really important subjects that I think often get overlooked. When you talk about something like blood sugar, I'll actually paraphrase from the book itself. You wrote, Greek physician Aristeas wrote, diabetes is a dreadful affliction, not very frequent among men. So you hear that and you say, okay, well, today it's pretty damn, widespread. What changed since the time of Aristeas in 2nd century AD to today, where we have an epidemic impacting so many?
Probably the biggest change, in relation to blood sugar levels increasing and the increased prevalence of diabetes, would really be refined sugar. I mean, no shocker there, right? Both from the sense of now 75% of all packaged foods contain added sugars, but also from the fact that we went from consuming just maybe 10 gallons of soft drinks per year in 1950, and by 1975 it was 55 gallons. So there was a fivefold increase in soft drink intake, basically from the 50s to the 70s. So when you have all this refined sugar, I mean, it's crazy when you think about it. If you break it down into the fact that we used to only get the amount of sugar in a can of Coke in 1900 all year, and now we're consuming 2 or 3 of those per day in regards to the amount of sugar. That's really the driving force. And it's really the children. I think I've mentioned this to you before, the fact that anywhere from 25 to even up to upwards of 50% of children's total caloric intake is coming from added sugars. And by the time, you're 16, 20 years old, you're metabolically broken so that you can't even really handle much more than 40 grams of sugar per day.
Yeah, we've spoke about this before, how addictive sugar is. You're talking about on level of cocaine, other things, and that's the sad part. But, it's been established that sugar is a causing agent in insulin resistance. But is there a scale to it as far as what types of sugars? Yes, we've seen, all the kind of crappier corn syrup and everything come in. But are there things we shouldn't be demonizing as much in sugars? We need some sugars, correct? So can you give us a scale of the worst to best sugars?
Yeah. So, I mean, of course, it always comes down to quantity. So you do have your healthier, more natural sugars like honey, 100% maple syrup. And then on the other side, you have high fructose corn syrup, refined, table sugar, which is obviously lacking any type of other anti-inflammatory molecules because it's just coming in a bottle or coming in a spoon and not packaged in a whole food that's going to provide other constituents, right? Mm-hmm. So you definitely are better off, getting, natural sugars from fruits and from honey and maple syrup. Now, that being said, you still want to pair those with protein, fat to curb any type of excessive sugar spike, because if you have a lot of those, you can end up going hypoglycemic and it leads to a vicious cycle. So there's always a happy medium. But I definitely think there's been an over demonization of all sugar for sure.
Yeah, it seems that way that we can't quite decipher, what is what here, and we just lump sugar together. Now, another part of the equation is the, usage of artificial sugars. So you have things like saccharin, sucralose, which is Splenda, aspartame, which is equal. And many people do replace regular sugar, let's say, with those just for the calorie content of 0 and thinking they can lose weight. But is it really safe? What does the research say? I know you wrote about it in the book, but is it safe?
So according to the FDA, they have set levels that are considered safe. And there's been actual human clinical studies giving amounts of saccharin and amounts of sucralose, which is in things like Splenda, below or at that threshold that's considered safe, that has been shown to not only lead to gut dysbiosis, but an increase in insulin resistance relatively quickly, like within just a week of consuming that. They've tested other ones, such as stevia, that has not shown that effect. So there are certain, basically, let's call them non-caloric sweeteners that have been shown to induce insulin resistance fairly quickly. And those two would be, again, saccharin and sucralose. And the ones that have not been shown to induce that would be like stevia, monk fruit, and even aspartame. I mean, aspartame obviously has a lot of animal studies that are showing, cancer and this and that. Those doses would be very, very hard to reach from a human intake. But in the human clinicals, aspartame didn't induce that insulin resistance. It was really those two, saccharin and sucralose.
What about something like xylitol, which you find sometimes in, toothpaste or gum because of the bacteria kind of inhibiting factor?
Right. Those also don't really seem to induce insulin resistance, although they do pull water with it in the gastrointestinal system, and there is more gastrointestinal disturbances, more watery stools, things like that.
Yeah. So let's move on to some things beyond the sugar factor, which is so prevalent, and a lot of people do, focus on that. But how do oils and fats play a role in blood sugar?
So insulin resistance can sort of be thought of as, many, many factors can cause it. Okay. Simply overshooting on your blood sugar consistently and then overshooting your insulin can make the body desensitized to insulin. So that's one way to induce it. Another way to induce it is through inflammation. Okay, so if you basically use these refined seed oils and you cook with them, you're going to create a tremendous amount of oxidative products that can, basically damage your cells and lead to insulin resistance through a different pathway. So the studies that show, if they're looking at things like, non-processed omega-6 seed oils and you don't cook with them, they don't really show harms. But as soon as you start cooking with those oils and then you consume them, then you're going to see all those harms that we just discussed.
And then when we switch over to even the micronutrients, which ones do we need to pay attention to for insulin resistance and the factor of diabetes?
There's several micronutrients, and I'll list them off, that are very key to blood sugar. Now, really, when it comes down to it, every single one is important, but there's key ones. The first one, and probably the most important, would be thiamine or vitamin B1. The second would be magnesium, because it's required to put thiamine in its active form in order to metabolize glucose in the body. The third one would be sodium, so not getting enough salt. We just published a review paper on 23 human clinical studies showing that low salt diets induce insulin resistance, elevated insulin levels, etc. Chromium is also very important for insulin, as well as potassium, and then even copper as well. So really those 6 are really, really key, and we can kind of dive into each one if you want.
Well, the one that interests me a lot, and the one that you call the secret insulin amplifier, is chromium. A lot of people look at that chromium picolinate like as a supplement to take for insulin, diabetes, all these other things. Talk about that and why you called it the secret insulin amplifier.
So chromium is released from the cell when you consume glucose. It's released from the cell to enhance insulin's effect. So without chromium, insulin doesn't really work that well. And from also a fat burning and also muscle growing perspective, chromium is very important to amplify insulin's effect for muscle growth. So even clinical studies giving chromium have not only shown weight loss and improvement in insulin resistance, but actually improvements in lean tissue mass gain. So from enhancing insulin's perspective, chromium is right there to do that. What's really interesting when I started learning about chromium is it was a nutrient just like B1 that I thought, we get so much in the diet versus, what's recommended that we should get. No one's really deficient. We should be fine. But when you actually start thinking about the things that deplete chromium from the body, like a high refined carbohydrate or high refined sugar intake or exercise or sweat, when you sweat, we lose actually a good amount of chromium. Then you can start to see how, like, if you constantly go into the sauna, but you never replace chromium back, that can be an issue. And the real key too is that when you lose chromium, its bioavailability is only 1%. So if you lose 7 micrograms, which is typically how much you'll lose in an hour of sweating, you have to consume 700 micrograms because you're only going to absorb 1% of that to get it back. So it's one of those nutrients, like very few nutrients have that low of a bioavailability where if you lose it, you have to get, 100-fold back to replace it.
Is that why I know people that sauna like once or twice a day and just, live in the sauna, kind of detox. That's their whole thing. And, hydrate as well, but they're not probably hydrating with enough mineral salts and everything else. Is that why many may find themselves deficient and almost in a state where they're not truly helping themselves by sauna so much without replenishing?
I totally think yes. Yeah. Particularly the loss of sodium. Copper is tremendous loss too through sweat. You lose a lot of nutrients, and if you're not replacing them back, including chromium, then you're going to have a lot of issues with energy levels for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate because we put such a high regard on these things like infrared saunas or just going in and sweating. We need to do that more in movement, but we don't look at the flip side that we are depleting in some ways, and if we don't replenish, we're in a worse state. And, speaking of all these things that we're, looking to optimize, we cannot forget about one of the biggest elephants in the room, no pun intended. Obesity is really like this thing that when you look at diabetes, blood sugar, insulin resistance, not to fat shame, not to put anything, but how big of an issue is the carrying of visceral fat, the lack of exercise and heavy weight. How big of an issue is that, and how correlated is that to diabetes and insulin resistance?
It's almost like the chicken or the egg. And I think we still don't even know, what's coming first and what's not, because, you start putting on or you start consuming a lot of refined sugars that directly causes visceral fat gain. So it's like the cortisol and the increase in the insulin is causing the visceral fat gain. But then the visceral fat gain is leading to worse insulin resistance as well. So it's like a vicious cycle. You'll be hard pressed to find an obese person who isn't insulin resistant. So I think, a lot of times what's driving that is both insulin and leptin resistance, so, in regards to obesity.
It leads me into something you wrote about metabolic flexibility. What does that mean and how can we promote it? Because I think it falls in line with this idea of being in the proper healthy weight class.
How I view metabolic flexibility is being able to handle like a reasonable amount of carbohydrates. That's kind of how I view it. Like if you're consistently in ketosis, you're not metabolically flexible. When you consume carbs, you're going to have a very insulin resistant, glucose curve, which is why when you are in ketosis for a long period of time, you're on a low carb diet. Before you get an oral glucose tolerance test, you're supposed to consume like 150 grams of carbs for 2 weeks. Otherwise, your glucose curve is going to look diabetic or pre-diabetic because you're just not used to utilizing glucose as fuel. So you want to be in a state where you are able to handle a fairly decent amount of carbohydrates. And really that comes down to being, active, exercise, having a good amount of muscle mass, getting your micronutrients in, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, let's talk about that diet. You call it the blood sugar fix diet within the book, but what does that look like as far as proteins, fats, carbs? You're saying carbs are not the enemy. Even sugar is not truly the enemy as long as it's in the proper ratios and everything and qualities. So what is the blood sugar fix diet?
So it's kind of like a scaled rating depending on what your baseline carbohydrate tolerance is. So if you're type 2 diabetic, then a lower amount of carbohydrates is important to allow you to get used to and your body used to handling the carbs. As you become pre-diabetic, so let's say less than 60 grams of carbs or so for someone who's type 2 diabetic is probably a good idea. When you go pre-diabetic, less than 100 grams of carbs. And then when you are normal healthy, somewhere in the range of 100 to 200 grams, higher end if you're on a more active day. It's typically the carb range.
Yeah, and going beyond diet, which is incredibly important, let's look at some of the systems and organs of the body, because I found this kind of fascinating as well as the brain's role in all of this and why it is so important within the idea of insulin resistance, how much it uses of insulin it produces. So can you talk about that, the brain's role in blood sugar optimization?
Yeah, what's interesting is everything comes from the mouth everything is affected then from the gut, and the gut affects the brain. And so what ends up happening is if you eat any type of inflammatory diet, you do increase intestinal permeability, and you then have basically endotoxin, or what's called LPS, lipopolysaccharide, that is now getting into the bloodstream, and which is not supposed to happen. That will activate basically the immune system in the brain to release things like tumor necrosis factor alpha and cause inflammation in the brain. And that can lead to basically central insulin, leptin resistance, but also peripheral resistance as well. So it's kind of crazy to think that what you eat affects your gut, which then affects the brain, and then that affects the entire body.
Yeah, I mean, it's all interconnected. And even if we move down for the brain just a little bit to the thyroid, talk about how that is so important when we're looking and talking about blood sugar.
Yeah, well, it's kind of like the system that sets your metabolism, like how fast your metabolism is. Are you able to burn, the same amount of calories as someone else? Like if someone has low thyroid, they will literally become fatter consuming the same amount of calories as someone who doesn't. So it's not just about calories. It also comes down to hormones, like the thyroid hormones. And the two minerals that are extremely important for thyroid health is iodine and sodium. Sodium allows iodine to get into the thyroid gland, and magnesium is important for ATP and the pump to do that. So even your micronutrient status will determine your thyroid status, which determines your metabolism, which determines, how well you can handle calories and how much your blood sugar might go up from a meal.
And what are those foods and things we could take to optimize our thyroid function?
So seafood, shellfish are good sources of iodine, but also sodium, which is both important for thyroid health. Liver is very important as well for overall micronutrient status. Eggs, there's not a single day that goes by where we're not having probably 3 pastured eggs in the morning. So I practice what's basically like more animal-based diet. Most of my calories are coming from, basically eggs, lean meats, yogurt, grass-fed yogurt, things like that. And then, as the side dish, so to speak, is the vegetables. Now, they're great because they're, you can have a half a plate of vegetables and it's barely any calories. It's super filling. And then the protein and the fats are what give you the long-term satiety. So combining both is really a great way to curb hunger. But if you don't tolerate vegetables, that's okay. It's not like it's super necessary because the nutrients in vegetables are very low bioavailability.
Mm-hmm. And if we move on to something like autoimmune conditions would continue to be on the rise, what's that connection there to diabetes and blood sugar?
Comes back to the immune system. You have these, basically, T helper cells, you have these other controller cells. And when you start sort of overstimulating the immune system, that's when autoimmunity can start kicking in. That's why you can start seeing diabetes. It's like a type 2 form, but it's not, it's like a type 1 form, but it's happening later on, like a latent, like adult onset diabetes. And so it all comes down to the inflammatory response from the food, damaging your immune system. And now you basically have too much of, one part of the immune system activated, not enough of the controller immune system kind of suppressing, the overinflammation. And that's really what triggers autoimmunity.
So much of what I'm hearing here, it's like, it really comes down to what you put in your body and the food. And we've done, what kind of role does big food play in all of this? And do you feel we should have more of a regulatory kind of like we do with banks? I'm not about big regulations. I'm not about big government or anything like that. But you look, this is getting out of hand. Kids are seriously obese and diabetes is just rampant. And it'll continue to go that way. And it seems that big food is the new big tobacco. And they're targeting children for sure.
Right.
Do you feel there needs to be more regulations or more oversight into big food and what they're providing, especially since they're targeting children?
100%. The biochemistry that occurs when you consume these refined foods, very similar to drugs of abuse like amphetamines, like cocaine. Obviously, not to the same degree, but just like not everyone who consumes alcohol becomes an alcoholic, right? Not everyone who consumes these processed foods is going to overconsume them, but a lot of people do. So, and we can't know who's going to, consume these foods and then really not be able to control themselves, right? So it's all for profit. It's basically legalized drugs in a way. And I don't know what the best step is. I more stick to the science and not necessarily the politics of it all. But we wouldn't have these foods if we didn't have these corporations. So
yeah,
it's almost like maybe there should be. I mean, taxing them is the easiest way to do that, but we know it doesn't always work either. So. Right. And then you don't want to deprive people of foods also that, if they're only consuming it 10 to 20% of the time and it's enjoyable for them. But I think you're right. I think from a child standpoint, they can't determine what's the right amount of junk food and what's not. So it's almost like, it really comes down to the parents. But at the same time, how do they definitely shouldn't be targeting children. That's for sure.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question really is, you can't take away all the freedoms of, choosing foods and everything like that and, move into that direction completely. You can educate the parents and go after that because the long-term ramifications of feeding children this way are, incredibly detrimental to health and to longevity and to happiness. So you're a parent yourself. You live a busy lifestyle. Kids live busier and more hectic than ever. Eating quickly on the run is something that happens more and more. That's just today's society. So we can't really change, I think, that too much. But what would be your recommendation to a parent listening right now that maybe has a pantry full of, General Mills and Nabisco and all the other stuff that's sweet and corn syrupy and easy, right? And the child kind of gets happy off of it and doesn't scream when he has a vegetable in front of him. Like, what's your advice to parents out there who are struggling, who I understand don't have the time sometimes, to do it?
Right. I would say for the majority of your foods, just practice the 80-20 rule. 80% of the time, eat healthy, nutritious foods. 80% of the time of your days, exercise well, and 20% of the time, have a rest day. 20% of the time, have some foods that you enjoy. And if you can maintain that balance, great. Lock away those foods that you really have no control over yourself, right? Like, don't even have them in the house. But the ones that, you're not going to just overconsume like crazy, but are still going to, give you that satisfaction. Okay, just make sure you limit yourself.
Yeah, I've noticed that in myself. Listen, I usually eat quite clean, but recently my niece had a drive for Girl Scout cookies. And, I helped her out, bought a bunch, like a shit ton, and put them in my trunk. And I've been handing them out to people because I didn't want them, but I brought some in. And then, I got a little hungry at night, and I was just like, what's in the pantry? And then you end up eating. They are addictive. I'm sorry. They're very good. And that's the thing. It's if you don't have it, I would have went to sleep slightly, hungry or something, but it's fine. You wake up next day, you're fine. I'm used to intermittent fasting. So if you have it around, you will reach for it. You will go. So one of the best ways I found, just don't have it, right? And again, I have it. This is my 20% anyway. It's not going to crush me or suddenly put me on, a downward spiral into just eating Girl Scout cookies all day long. Yeah. But I think that's one of the best ways I've noticed of really keeping a cleaner diet is just don't have that stuff around you. Right. Outside of diet, what are some of the supplements you would advise people to look at when you're looking at optimizing blood sugar, diabetes? Of course, we went over the chromium, the thiamine, but are there others that you'd say, hey, you should check these out?
So there's a really cool form of thiamine. It's called allithiamine. It's the form that's found in garlic, and it's particularly highly brain and cellular bioavailable. I actually decided to try this on myself, my own blood sugar. So I started with a A1C of 5.2 to 5.3. I took 300 milligrams of allithiamine for, I think it was about 2 months, and it dropped my A1C down to 4.8. And so, allithiamine, benfotiamine, which is another kind of thiamine similarity, but it has good cellular penetration as well. Very good for improving blood sugar levels and enhancing insulin sensitivity. The key, and this is another nutrient, just like chromium. When I looked at thiamine, I looked at the diet, how much we're getting. I looked at how much we need, per what the, government says. I go, wow, there's going to be very few people that are deficient. But when you start looking at B1, we barely store any vitamin B1. We store about 30 milligrams. So you can become really depleted very quickly from being sick, just, having a cold, from inflammation in the body, from exercise. Even drinking coffee or tea, black tea or green tea, close to your foods will inactivate thiamine and reduce its absorption. So there's all these factors that really increase one's need for thiamine, including a diet high in refined carbs and sugar. So we've known actually giving parenteral nutrition can cause B1 deficiency because it's almost like it's based on need. So when you start increasing the need for thiamine by having a high carb diet, it's one of those nutrients where its need just dramatically shoots up and you can actually induce deficiency despite consuming quote unquote enough because you're putting added pressure on the body. So it's just one of those key nutrients that sits at the top of glycolysis. There's certain enzymes like transketolase and other enzymes as well, alpha ketoglutarate in the Krebs cycle that depend on thiamine to basically metabolize glucose so we can make ATP. And it's just one of those amazing nutrients that if you become deficient in, and there's been clinical studies back in 1939, back in 1940, that just a few weeks of eating a low thiamine diet will induce pre-diabetic and diabetic glucose curves, but certainly after a couple months.
So the idea of intermittent fasting within blood sugar, diabetics, should they ever intermittent fast?
I think intermittent fasting is fine, also known as time-restricted eating. But you can get yourself into trouble if you're not getting enough micronutrients because you're, let's say, only eating one meal a day and that meal isn't really optimized well. And you do that for a really, really prolonged period of time. Plus you're active and your nutrient status, is being depleted through sweat and this and that. And then you're only eating once a day. It's hard to really pack in all the nutrients in one meal. So intermittent fasting is a tool, but don't overdo it.
What are your thoughts on continuous glucose monitoring that you see everyone slapping on the back of their, triceps and promoting these days?
Yeah, it's good to get your baseline to tell you, okay, this sour mix in my alcoholic drink just shot my glucose up to 160, right? It's good to figure out what's really spiking your glucose levels because your insulin's gonna, even though it's not tracking insulin, is gonna look very similar. But after a while, you don't want to become super hyper focused because a little bit of a glucose spike is fine. That's not a big deal, especially if you're metabolically fit. So you said the baseline status, just like you would get blood work for a baseline, but you're not going to be testing your blood work every single day, right? And hyper focusing on it. So use it as a tool, as a starting point, and then, don't, worry about it all the time.
Yeah, I like that advice because it is true. Too many people get hyper-focused and then lose sight of the big picture of understanding other elements of it, not just glucose, and kind of, only focus on that, only stress on that. And then you stress eat, basically. So everything you eat, as good as it is, isn't going to be absorbed. You're going to be in a sympathetic state, that isn't good for digestion. And you start to not understand the results because it doesn't seem like the food itself is impacted. It's more your response to it. So you get in that, disease cycle almost as well, just through the stress response of it. So I always ask this at the end with you. What's the next book that's going to be out in 2 weeks?
Well, probably won't be out that soon. Probably going to look towards doing like a cookbook, and then may do something on hydration. I've really wanted to do an in-depth. The Salt Fix was mostly salt. Wasn't really. It was a little bit hydration, but I want to do something more on water. But that's going to take me years to do. So.
Oh yeah, years. Oh, that's the first I've heard you say it's going to take years because you're popping out books every other month. So, but I think that's a fascinating one. Listen, the cookbook everyone does love. I just had Candice Kamai, the cook, on yesterday, and she branched out into more spirituality, and everyone's just go back to the cooking stuff and everything. It's that was good too. I love the spirituality stuff, but everyone loves a good cookbook. So I'd love to see you put on the cooking hat and and show us what's the best way to eat your standards. So Doc, always great to see you. Thank you so much for everything you do. Can't wait for the next book, and keep knocking them out.
Thanks for having me on.
Optimizing blood sugar levels and insulin sensitivity is key for a long and healthy life. Check out Dr. DiNicolantonio's book, The Blood Sugar Fix, and take the necessary actions to ensure you don't become a statistic in the growing diabetes epidemic. Until next time, continue writing your own healing story.